Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Tonight we're embarking on one of the most haunting journeys through gaming history, diving deep into the complete timeline of Fallout, a world where humanity's greatest triumph became its ultimate nightmare. This is the story of how atomic energy, once promised as the key to unlimited prosperity and peace, instead delivered 2 hours of nuclear fire that changed everything forever. Before we begin this epic journey through the wasteland of human ambition, take a moment to hit that like button if you're ready for tonight's adventure into the ruins of tomorrow. Don't forget to subscribe if you enjoy these deep dives into the lore and legends that shape our favorite gaming worlds. Drop a comment and let me know what part of the world you're listening from tonight. I absolutely love seeing our global community come together for these stories that span centuries and continents. Now get comfortable, maybe dim those lights, settle into your favorite spot, and prepare yourself for a tale that stretches across more than 200 years of survival, hope, and the indomitable human spirit rising from atomic ashes. Picture this. October 23rd. 2077, it's a beautiful Saturday morning in suburban America. Coffee percolates in kitchens across the nation. Children play in backyards while parents read newspapers filled with headlines about the ongoing war in Alaska. The leaves are turning golden in the crisp autumn air, and for a brief moment, despite the distant thunder of conflict, life feels almost normal, almost peaceful. But at 9:13 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, everything changed forever. The first nuclear warhead detonated over an American city, its blinding flash instantly vaporizing everything within miles. Within minutes, hundreds more followed. China, America, and their allies unleashed 2 centuries of accumulated nuclear fury in just 2 hours. 2 hours that ended a world and began another. When the radioactive dust finally settled, civilization as humanity had known it for millennia was gone. The great cities were crater-filled ruins. The blue skies had turned sickly yellow with radiation. And beneath the earth, in massive underground shelters called vaults, the survivors huddled in their metal tombs, waiting for a world above that might never be safe again. But here's the thing that will haunt you as we journey through this timeline together. The Great War, the nuclear apocalypse that destroyed everything, wasn't really about territory or resources or political ideology. It was about a lie. A carefully constructed deception that had been building for decades, orchestrated by the very companies and governments that promised to protect their people. You see, the bombs that fell that day didn't just end the old world, they were meant to. The question that will echo through every chapter of our story tonight is this. What if the apocalypse wasn't an accident of war, but the planned beginning of something far more sinister? What if the vaults weren't shelters at all, but laboratories? And what if the people who caused the end of the world had been preparing for what came next all along? As we trace the timeline from the resource wars of the 2050s through the rise and fall of nations in the wasteland, we'll uncover the truth about Vault-Tec Corporation, the Enclave, and a conspiracy that spans centuries. We'll witness the emergence of heroes from the darkness, the birth of new civilizations from atomic fire, and the eternal struggle between those who would control the future and those who fight for freedom. This is the story of how war never changes, but humanity somehow always finds a way to endure, to hope, and to build something beautiful from the ruins of yesterday. So take a deep breath, let the worries of your day fade away, and join me as we step into the wasteland where every sunrise is both an ending and a beginning, where every choice echoes across generations, and where the most important battles aren't fought with weapons, but with the simple human refusal to give up hope. Our journey begins not with the bombs, but decades before in a world that looks familiar but isn't quite our own, where the promise of atomic power led humanity down a very different path. You are standing at the edge of history itself, a chronicler of the atomic age, tasked with documenting the rise and fall and rise again of human civilization. Your name doesn't matter anymore. What matters is the story you carry, the complete record of how one world ended and countless others began. The year is 2287, more than 2 centuries after the Great War, and you've spent your life gathering fragments of the past from the ruins of the future. You are a historian of the wasteland, a keeper of pre-war knowledge and post-war wisdom, moving between the scattered settlements and hidden vaults that dot the American continent like islands of memory in a sea of radioactive sand. Around you stretches the Commonwealth, what was once the proud state of Massachusetts. Boston's skyline still reaches toward the heavens, but now those gleaming towers are skeletal remains wrapped in rust and radiation. The Charles River flows, thick with 200 years of atomic sediment, its waters glowing faintly green in the perpetual twilight of nuclear winter's long aftermath. This is a world where nature itself has been rewritten by invisible fire. The trees, where they still grow, twist upward in impossible spirals, their bark hardened into metallic scales that ring like wind chimes in the irradiated breeze. Strange flowers bloom in impossible colors, beautiful and deadly, their petals drifting like radioactive snow across settlements where children learn to read Geiger counters before they learn to read books. The air tastes of copper and ozone, carries the scent of rusted metal and something else, something that makes your skin tingle with the memory of energy unleashed beyond human control. Every breath reminds you that this world was transformed by forces that once seemed like gifts from the gods themselves. Atomic power, the taming of the very heart of matter, the promise of infinite energy, infinite possibility. But you've seen the vaults. You know what infinite possibility looks like when it's twisted by infinite ambition. Your equipment is a mixture of scavenged pre-war technology and post-war ingenuity. A Pip-Boy 3000 strapped to your wrist, its amber screen flickering, with radiation readings that haven't dropped to safe levels in 2 centuries. Your pack carries holotapes and written records, some recovered from the ruins of universities and libraries, others traded from fellow wanderers who've spent their lives piecing together the scattered fragments of human knowledge. In your travels, you've walked through the husks of great cities and the thriving communities that have grown in their shadows. You've seen the mighty walls of Diamond City, built in the ruins of Fenway Park, where survivors huddle together and try to recreate something like the civilization their ancestors knew. You've visited settlements like Sanctuary Hills, where suburban homes have been transformed into fortresses, their white picket fences replaced by razor wire and watchtowers. You've descended into the depths of Vault 111, where you first learned the truth about cryogenic preservation and witnessed the pods that held an entire community in frozen sleep for over 200 years. The silence in those underground chambers is absolute, broken only by the distant hum of machinery that continued working long after its builders turned to dust. But it's not just the ruins that tell the story. You've met the people of this new world, each one carrying their own piece of the puzzle. There's the ghoul in Goodneighbor who remembers the day the bombs fell, his skin transformed into something resembling leather, and his voice carrying the weight of 2 centuries of survival. There's the synth in Diamond City who doesn't even know they're artificial, living a life as real and meaningful as any humans, while others hunt them as abominations. You've encountered the Brotherhood of Steel in their massive airship, the Prydwen floating above the Commonwealth like a reminder that some people still believe technology can save humanity if it's properly controlled. You've walked with railroad agents who risk everything to free synthetic humans from bondage, believing that consciousness itself is sacred regardless of whether it springs from flesh or circuitry. And somewhere beneath it all, deeper than any vault, more hidden than any bunker, lies the Institute, the underground kingdom of science where the brightest minds of the pre-war world continued their work, emerging 2 centuries later with technologies that blur the line between miracle and nightmare. Your journey has taken you far beyond the Commonwealth. You've walked the scorched earth of the capital wasteland, where the ruins of Washington, D.C. still glow with residual radiation from direct nuclear strikes. You've crossed the Mojave Desert, where the neon lights of New Vegas burn bright against the night sky, powered by the same Hoover Dam that channeled the Colorado River before the bombs fell. Each location tells part of the story. Each survivor carries a fragment of the truth, and slowly, piece by piece, you've assembled the complete timeline of how humanity's greatest achievement became its greatest catastrophe, and how, somehow, life found a way to continue. The wind picks up, carrying with it the distant sound of settlers working their irradiated fields, of children learning to read by candlelight in schoolhouses built from salvaged metal, of traders calling out their wares in marketplaces where bottle caps have replaced dollars as currency. This is not the world that was promised in those gleaming advertisements for atomic energy, but it's the world that emerged from atomic fire, and in its own way, it's beautiful. Tonight, you'll share the complete story, from the resource wars that preceded the bombs to the factional conflicts that shape the wasteland today. You'll reveal the truth about the corporations that profited from humanity's destruction, the vaults that were never meant to save anyone, and the people who refuse to let hope die. No matter how dark the world becomes, the radiation storm brewing on the horizon flickers with green lightning, and in that otherworldly glow you begin to remember how it all started, decades before the bombs fell, in a world where atomic energy was humanity's brightest dream. The story begins not with nuclear fire, but with thirst. In the year 2052, 25 years before the Great War that would end civilization, the world was already dying. But it wasn't radiation that was killing it. It was the simple, desperate need for the black liquid that had powered human progress for over a century. Oil. The European Commonwealth, that grand experiment in continental unity, crumbled first. What had once been a beacon of cooperation dissolved into a patchwork of warring nation-states as each country fought desperately for the remaining petroleum reserves. The streets of Paris ran red with more than wine. London's fog carried the acrid smell of burning refineries. Berlin's walls weren't just political anymore. They were survival barriers protecting precious fuel deposits from neighboring armies. By 2054, the situation had become apocalyptic in ways the world couldn't yet imagine. The Middle East, that ancient crossroads of civilization and centuries-long keeper of the world's oil wealth, became the epicenter of humanity's first taste of nuclear warfare. Not the massive exchange that would come later, but smaller, more targeted strikes. Tactical nukes, they called them, as if there was anything tactical about unleashing the power of the atom in anger. The oil fields burned with radioactive fire, their black smoke carrying particles that would poison the air for decades. But the world barely noticed. They were too busy fighting over what remained. Across the Atlantic, America watched Europe tear itself apart and felt secure in its isolation. The United States had always been blessed with abundant natural resources, vast territories, and the technological innovation to exploit both. But by the early 2060s, even American confidence began to crack. The Alaska Pipeline, that engineering marvel that had brought Northern oil south for generations, was running dry. The wells that had once seemed infinite were producing less each year, and the quality of what remained was declining rapidly. It was then that America's gaze turned westward across the Pacific to China. The People's Republic had been watching the Western world's energy crisis with a mixture of concern and opportunity. They had oil reserves of their own, but more importantly, they had something the rest of the world desperately needed: discipline. While Europe fought itself to exhaustion and America struggled to maintain its standard of living, China prepared. But preparation only went so far. By 2066, China's own energy situation had become critical. Their massive population, their growing industrial capacity, and their military ambitions all demanded more fuel than their domestic reserves could provide. The solution was obvious to their leadership. Alaska's remaining oil reserves, now jealously guarded by a weakened America, would solve their energy crisis and establish Chinese dominance in the post-oil world. The invasion began with subtlety. Chinese submarines appeared in American waters with increasing frequency. Trade disputes escalated into military posturing. Border incidents in the Bering Strait became regular occurrences. The American government, already strained by domestic energy shortages and economic instability, found itself facing a choice between diplomatic compromise and military confrontation. They chose confrontation. Operation Anchorage began in 2077, though most Americans didn't recognize it as the beginning of the end. To them, it was just another military campaign, another chance for American technological superiority to triumph over foreign aggression. The government's propaganda machine went into overdrive, producing recruitment posters that promised glory, honor, and victory against the communist threat. The reality on the Alaskan front was far different. This wasn't the quick, clean conflict the politicians had promised. It was brutal, grinding warfare in some of the most hostile terrain on Earth. Temperatures that could freeze exposed flesh in minutes, supply lines stretched across thousands of miles of wilderness, and an enemy that had learned from every Western military campaign of the past century. But America had something the Chinese didn't expect. In the secret laboratories of Westech and Robco Industries, military contractors had been developing a new kind of soldier, not a better trained human, but a human in a better shell. The T-45D power armor represented a quantum leap in military technology, turning individual soldiers into walking tanks capable of carrying weapons that would normally require a crew to operate. The first power armor units deployed to Alaska in 2067 changed the nature of warfare forever. Soldiers who had been pinned down by Chinese forces suddenly found themselves walking through enemy fire as if it were rain. Machine gun bullets that would have torn through conventional armor bounced off the T-45D's steel plates like pebbles. The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical one. Chinese forces, already fighting far from home in impossible conditions, found themselves facing what seemed like invincible mechanical demons. Yet even as America celebrated these tactical victories, strategic thinkers on both sides recognized a disturbing truth. The war in Alaska was consuming resources faster than either nation could sustainably produce them. Every power armor suit required rare minerals and precision manufacturing. Every bullet, every bomb, every meal for the soldiers represented resources that weren't available for civilian needs. Meanwhile, in corporate boardrooms and government bunkers far from the front lines, a different kind of war was being planned. Vault-Tec Corporation, which had made its fortune in the pre-war years selling underground shelters to paranoid millionaires and forward-thinking communities, was suddenly finding itself with contracts larger than entire government budgets. The official story was simple and reassuring. In the event of nuclear war, these massive underground shelters would preserve American civilians until the surface world was safe again. Each vault would be a self-contained community complete with living quarters, food production, water purification, and all the amenities needed to wait out the radioactive storms above. The truth, as you've learned in your years wandering the wasteland, was far more sinister. The Vault program wasn't about preserving human life, it was about studying it. Each of the 122 vaults constructed during this period was designed to test some aspect of human behavior under controlled conditions. How would people react to isolation, to overcrowding, to artificial scarcity, to genetic manipulation? The residents of each vault became unwitting test subjects in experiments that violated every principle of medical ethics and human dignity. But in 2067, as the first vaults neared completion and the war in Alaska intensified, the full scope of this betrayal was still hidden. To the American public, Vault-Tec represented security, preparation, and the uniquely American belief that any problem could be solved with enough money and technology. The war dragged on. Chinese forces, despite their early successes, found themselves trapped in an increasingly hopeless situation. They had gained some of Alaska's oil resources, but at a cost that was bankrupting their economy and destroying their military. American power armor units, supported by an endless stream of supplies from the continental United States, were slowly but steadily pushing them back. By 2076, it was clear to observers on both sides that the Anchorage campaign was reaching its climax. China's position was unsustainable, but retreat would mean admitting defeat and accepting American dominance in the post-oil world. America's position was stronger, but the war was draining resources that might be needed for other challenges. The Soviet Union, still reeling from its own internal conflicts, watched nervously from the sidelines, knowing that whoever won in Alaska would turn their attention to the world's remaining energy reserves next. Neither side could afford to lose. Neither side could afford to keep fighting. And in the shadows, corporate and government leaders who had profited from the conflict were already making plans for the world that would come after the shooting stopped. The stage was set for something unprecedented in human history, not just a war between nations, but a war that would consume nations themselves, leaving only ashes and the carefully prepared survivors who had seen the end coming and positioned themselves to profit from it. The resource wars were nearly over, but the real war, the one that would determine whether humanity had a future at all, was just beginning. October 23, 2077. The morning dawned crisp and clear across the American continent, the kind of autumn day that makes people grateful to be alive. In suburban neighborhoods from coast to coast, families were settling into their weekend routines. Children raked leaves into piles they would later jump through. Parents read newspapers over coffee that was still affordable, though everything else seemed to cost more each month. The headlines that morning told a story of progress and hope. American forces had finally achieved decisive victory in Alaska. Chinese troops were retreating across the Bering Strait in disarray. The long, costly war that had drained both nations was finally coming to an end. Peace seemed not just possible, but inevitable. At 9:13 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, every television and radio in America interrupted regular programming for an emergency broadcast. The alert signal, that piercing tone that had tested weekly for years without anyone taking it seriously, suddenly carried weight that crushed the breath from millions of lungs simultaneously. Nuclear weapons had been detected incoming. For most Americans, the next few minutes passed in a kind of suspended disbelief. This couldn't be real. Not now, not when victory was so close, not when the world seemed to finally be stepping back from the brink of madness. The air raid sirens that wailed across the continent sounded like the death cry of civilization itself. Those fortunate enough to live near designated vaults had perhaps 20 minutes to reach safety. They ran through streets already clogged with panicking crowds, clutching children and whatever possessions they could carry, their minds unable to fully process what was happening. The lucky ones made it to the massive steel doors before they sealed forever. The unlucky ones pressed against that metal barrier, their screams lost beneath the sound of mechanisms designed to keep the outside world permanently outside. But most people weren't near vaults at all. Most people were caught in their homes, their offices, their schools and shopping centers when the first warheads began detonating across American cities. The Chinese strategy was simple and devastating. Strike at the population centers first, the military installations second. Break American morale before eliminating American capability. New York City died in a flash of light brighter than the sun. The fireball that consumed Manhattan reached temperatures of 10 million degrees, instantly vaporizing everything within a 3-mile radius. The famous skyline, those proud towers that had symbolized American prosperity and ambition, melted like candles in a furnace. 8 million people became shadows burned into walls, their entire existence reduced to atomic-level scatter in microseconds. Washington, D.C. followed moments later. The White House, the Capitol building, the monuments to democracy and freedom that had stood for centuries all vanished in another miniature sun. The leaders who had started this war, who had made the decisions that led to this moment, were incinerated before they could fully comprehend the consequences of their choices. But the horror was only beginning. Boston, Philadelphia, Chicago, Los Angeles, San Francisco. Every major population center across the continent became ground zero for weapons that unleashed the fundamental forces of the universe in service of human hatred. The electromagnetic pulses from the detonations knocked out communications across vast areas. Power grids collapsed. Transportation networks simply ceased to exist. Within the first hour, over 100 million Americans were dead. The casualty figures were beyond human comprehension, beyond the ability of any surviving government apparatus to even count, let alone respond to. Hospitals that hadn't been vaporized found themselves dealing with injuries that no medical training had prepared them for. Radiation sickness, burns that penetrated to the bone, blindness from looking at the detonations even from hundreds of miles away. But America's nuclear response was automatic, unstoppable, and just as devastating. The moment Chinese missiles were confirmed inbound, computer systems across the American military began launching counterstrike after counterstrike. Minuteman ICBMs erupted from hidden silos throughout the Great Plains, their trajectories calculated to turn Chinese population centers into radioactive wastelands. Beijing burned with atomic fire. Shanghai, Guangzhou, Hong Kong. The great cities of Chinese civilization, repositories of thousands of years of human culture and achievement, were reduced to radioactive rubble in the space of minutes. The Chinese leadership, safely buried in their own bunkers deep beneath the earth, watched their nation die on screens that flickered and went dark one by one. The Soviet Union, caught between the two nuclear giants, tried desperately to remain neutral. Their leaders issued frantic diplomatic communications attempting to broker an immediate ceasefire. But the logic of nuclear warfare had taken over. When ICBMs are in flight, diplomacy becomes irrelevant. When cities are burning, restraint becomes impossible. Soviet missiles joined the deadly exchange, targeting both Chinese and American military installations in a desperate attempt to prevent either side from achieving total victory. By noon, the nuclear exchange had expanded beyond the three primary combatants. European nations, their governments barely functional after decades of resource wars, found themselves dragged into the conflict by alliance obligations and military automation. NATO protocols triggered American weapons stationed in European bases to launch at Warsaw Pact targets. Soviet submarines surfaced to fire their payloads at Western European cities. In just 2 hours, human civilization suffered more destruction than it had accumulated in all previous wars combined. The atomic weapons that had once promised unlimited energy and unprecedented prosperity became instruments of unlimited destruction and unprecedented suffering. Every nuclear power plant on the planet became a potential catastrophe as cooling systems failed and backup generators ran out of fuel. The environmental consequences were immediate and catastrophic. Nuclear winter began setting in before the last missiles reached their targets. The massive amounts of dust, debris, and radioactive particles thrown into the atmosphere blocked sunlight across entire continents. Temperatures began dropping within days. Growing seasons ended abruptly as crops froze in fields that glowed with residual radiation. But perhaps the most horrifying aspect of the Great War wasn't its immediate destruction, but its deliberate precision. This wasn't random violence or uncontrolled escalation. Every target had been carefully selected years in advance. Every warhead had been positioned to maximize both physical and psychological damage. The war planners on both sides had spent decades calculating exactly how to destroy not just their enemy's military capability, but their enemy's will to continue existing. In the aftermath of the initial exchange, as the radioactive dust began to settle, automated systems continued the slaughter. Military computers, programmed to continue fighting even after their human operators were dead, launched wave after wave of remaining weapons at targets that might no longer even exist. Robot sentries activated across the wasteland, programmed to kill anything that moved in areas that were now empty of all life. The most disturbing revelation, one that wouldn't become clear until decades later, was that some of the most destructive aspects of the Great War weren't accidental at all. The forced evolutionary virus, a biological weapon that had been designed to create super soldiers, was released during the nuclear exchange. But it wasn't released by enemy action. American facilities deliberately contaminated their own territories, apparently as part of some larger experiment in population control and genetic manipulation. Vault-Tec facilities that should have opened their doors to desperate survivors remained sealed, their computer systems programmed to ignore the screams and pleas of people who had followed government instructions to seek shelter at these locations. The lucky ones died quickly from radiation exposure. The unlucky ones survived long enough to understand that they had been betrayed by the very institutions they had trusted to protect them. As night fell on October 23, 2077, the world that humans had built over 10,000 years of civilization was gone. The great cities were radioactive ruins. The governments were either dead or hiding in bunkers, cut off from the populations they had once ruled. The economic systems that had driven human progress for centuries had simply ceased to exist, but deep underground in facilities that had been prepared for exactly this outcome, other humans were settling in for what they knew would be a very long wait. They had food for decades, water purification systems, and careful plans for rebuilding civilization according to their own design. They had watched the world burn from the safety of their shelters, and now they were ready to begin the real work. The Great War was over. The great experiment in human survival and manipulation was just beginning. In the immediate aftermath of the nuclear exchange, as radiation storms raged across the continent and the temperature began its inexorable drop toward nuclear winter, the sealed vaults represented humanity's last, best hope for survival. From the outside, this conclusion seemed inescapable. The surface world was a hellscape of radioactive ruins and deadly weather. Underground, carefully selected populations lived in climate-controlled environments with abundant food, clean water, and all the amenities necessary for human civilization to continue. The vault dwellers themselves, at least initially, believed they were the fortunate ones. As the great steel doors sealed shut on October 23rd, families huddled together in the pristine corridors of their underground homes, grateful beyond measure that they had won the lottery of survival. The children, too young to fully understand what had happened above, quickly adapted to their new environment. The adults, traumatized by the speed with which their world had ended, threw themselves into the routines and responsibilities of underground life. Vault 13, located in Southern California, became the archetypal success story that Vault-Tec had promised. Its 1,000 residents settled into a routine that seemed almost idyllic compared to the horrors they had narrowly escaped. The hydroponic gardens produced fresh vegetables. The water recycling systems functioned flawlessly. The Vault's educational facilities ensured that children continued learning, that human knowledge and culture would be preserved for future generations. The overseer of Vault 13, a middle-aged engineer named Martin Frobisher, had been selected for his combination of technical expertise and natural leadership ability. In the early days after sealing, he held daily briefings that painted a picture of orderly transition toward eventual resettlement of the surface world. The Vault's computers projected that radiation levels would return to safe levels within 25 years, perhaps 50 at the outside. It seemed like a reasonable period to wait for the rebirth of civilization. Similar scenes played out in vaults across the continent. Vault 8, which would later become the foundation of Vault City, established what seemed like a model community. Underground, scientists and engineers worked to refine water purification and food production technologies. Teachers developed curricula that would prepare the next generation for the challenges of rebuilding. Medical staff treated the minor ailments and injuries of underground life while maintaining careful records of radiation exposure among those who had arrived at the last minute. The first generation of vault dwellers, those who remembered the world before the bombs, took comfort in recreating familiar social structures underground. They formed clubs and committees, organized entertainment and education, celebrated birthdays and holidays with the same enthusiasm they had shown on the surface. The artificial day and night cycles, the carefully regulated temperature and humidity, the abundance of resources all conspired to create an environment that felt safe, secure, and sustainable. Children born in the vaults during those first years knew nothing of the world above. To them, the corridors and chambers of their underground home represented the entirety of human existence. They played games in the common areas, attended classes in the educational levels, and learned practical skills in the workshops and laboratories. Their world was bounded by steel walls and powered by fusion reactors, but within those boundaries, life seemed rich and meaningful. The technological systems that maintained the vaults functioned with remarkable reliability during these early decades. Vault-Tec's engineers had designed every component with redundancy and longevity in mind. The air purification system scrubbed every molecule of atmosphere within the sealed environment. The fusion reactors provided abundant power for all conceivable needs. The water recycling systems were so efficient that some vaults actually improved the quality of groundwater in their areas. Regular communication protocols between vaults created a sense of broader community among the scattered survivors. Weekly radio check-ins confirmed that other facilities were operational and thriving. Status reports detailed population levels, resource consumption, and progress on various reconstruction projects. To the inhabitants of any individual vault, it appeared that humanity had successfully weathered its greatest crisis and was preparing for a triumphant return to the surface. The illusion of normalcy was so complete that many vault dwellers began to forget the horror of what had driven them underground in the first place. The radiation readings that maintenance crews recorded during their brief excursions to surface monitoring stations became abstract numbers rather than measurements of deadly contamination. The reports of successful agricultural experiments conducted in sealed surface facilities suggested that reclamation of the outside world was proceeding ahead of schedule. But even in those early years, careful observers might have noticed inconsistencies in the official narrative. Some vaults that had been expected to maintain regular communication suddenly went silent, their radio calls unanswered, despite repeated attempts to re-establish contact. Maintenance personnel who ventured outside for equipment repairs sometimes returned with stories that didn't match the optimistic projections from Vault-Tec's computers. More troubling were the subtle differences between supposedly identical vault facilities. While the basic architecture and life support systems were standardized, each vault had unique features that served no obvious purpose. Some had medical facilities far larger than their populations would ever require. Others had been constructed with unusual social spaces or missing standard amenities. The explanations provided by Vault-Tec representatives were always reasonable, but they didn't quite add up to a coherent picture. The psychological effects of long-term isolation began manifesting in ways that the original vault designers had claimed to anticipate and plan for. Depression, anxiety, and interpersonal conflict were common in all the facilities. But the solutions provided by Vault-Tec's psychological protocols seemed designed more to study these problems than to solve them. Counseling sessions were recorded in minute detail. Behavioral modifications were tested and documented. Social experiments were conducted under the guise of community improvement programs. Perhaps most disturbing was the gradual realization among some vault dwellers that their isolation might be unnecessary. Radiation readings from surface monitoring stations were inconsistent with projections about recovery time. Trade caravans were reportedly moving through areas that should have been uninhabitably contaminated. Radio signals from outside communities suggested that some surface settlements were not only surviving, but thriving. Yet when residents of these vaults requested permission to send exploration teams to investigate surface conditions, they were told that such expeditions would violate safety protocols. When they asked why their vault couldn't establish communication with these outside communities, they were informed that radio contact might compromise the security of their location. When they demanded to see the data that supported continued isolation, they were reminded that such information was classified for the safety of the entire community. The truth, which wouldn't become fully apparent until much later, was that the vaults had never been intended as temporary shelters. They were laboratories, and their inhabitants were test subjects in experiments designed to study human behavior under controlled conditions. The isolation, the artificial scarcity, the social pressures and psychological manipulation were not unfortunate side effects of underground survival, but carefully planned variables in studies that violated every principle of informed consent and human dignity. Some vault dwellers began to suspect this truth during those early decades. They formed small groups to quietly investigate the inconsistencies in their situation. They asked uncomfortable questions about Vault-Tec's true motives. They proposed alternative explanations for why their underground prison might have been designed as it was, but these voices of doubt were systematically marginalized and silenced. The social structures within the vaults had been carefully designed to discourage dissent and reward conformity. Those who questioned the official narrative found themselves excluded from positions of authority, denied access to resources, and subjected to psychological pressure that gradually wore down their resistance. The first false conclusion, that the vaults represented humanity's salvation, became the foundation for decades of systematic deception and abuse. And in the growing suspicion among some vault dwellers that their situation was not what it seemed, the seeds of future revelation and rebellion were quietly taking root. By 2161, nearly a century after the Great War, the sealed world of the vaults was beginning to crack, not just metaphorically but literally. Vault 13, that shining example of underground survival, faced a crisis that would shatter the illusion of safety and self-sufficiency that had sustained its inhabitants for 3 generations. The water chip, a critical component of the vault's purification system, had finally succumbed to decades of constant use. Without it, the recycling systems that had kept 1,000 people alive in their underground sanctuary would fail within months. The clean, abundant water that had made vault life possible was about to become a memory, leaving the residents with a choice between slow death by dehydration and the terrifying prospect of venturing into the radioactive wasteland above. The Vault Dweller, as history would remember, the brave volunteer who accepted this impossible mission, emerged from Vault 13's great door into a world that defied every projection, every computer model, every reassurance that Vault-Tec had provided. The surface wasn't the sterile, lifeless wasteland of official reports. It was alive, vibrant, and dangerous in ways that no underground education could have prepared anyone for. The first revelation came within hours of leaving the vault. Radiation levels, while elevated above pre-war standards, weren't immediately lethal. The environmental suits and protective gear that Vault-Tec had insisted would be necessary for any surface excursion proved to be excessive for most areas. More shocking still were the signs of human habitation scattered across the landscape. Shady Sands, a small farming community built on the ruins of a pre-war town, represented everything the Vault Dwellers had been told was impossible. Here were people not just surviving but thriving on the surface, growing crops in irradiated soil, raising children who had never known the sterile safety of underground life. Their leader, Aradesh, spoke of trade routes connecting settlements across hundreds of miles, of caravans carrying goods between communities that had rebuilt themselves from the ashes of the old world. The social structures of these surface communities bore little resemblance to the carefully regulated hierarchies of Vault society. Leadership was earned through competence and respect rather than appointed through bureaucratic processes. Resources were allocated based on need and contribution rather than predetermined quotas. Most remarkably, these communities were growing, expanding, sending out explorers and traders who mapped new territories and established new settlements with each passing year. But the surface world also harbored dangers that no Vault Dweller could have imagined. The creatures that roamed the wasteland had been transformed by decades of radiation exposure into something both familiar and alien. Radroaches the size of small dogs scuttled through ruins, their carapaces hardened by atomic fire into natural armor. Brahmin, the 2-headed cattle that had become the backbone of wasteland agriculture, grazed peacefully despite mutations that would have been considered monstrous in the pre-war world. More disturbing were the human settlements that had taken darker paths toward survival. Raider gangs roamed the wasteland, their members scarred and twisted by radiation, drugs, and violence. They survived by preying on the productive communities, stealing resources rather than creating them, leaving destruction in their wake. These weren't the organized military forces that Vault combat training had prepared for, but chaotic bands driven by desperation and madness. The Hub, a massive trading post built around a pre-war truck stop, revealed the true scope of surface civilization's recovery. Merchant caravans from across the wasteland converged here, bringing news and goods from settlements hundreds of miles away. The Hub's leaders spoke casually of trade routes that connected communities from the Pacific coast to the Colorado River, of cities rising from the ruins of Los Angeles and San Francisco. Yet beneath this apparent success, the Vault Dweller discovered a darker current running through wasteland society. Strange reports filtered in from traders and travelers, stories of settlements where people disappeared overnight, of communities that had prospered for years before suddenly falling silent. Most disturbing were the rumors of creatures that had once been human but were now something else entirely, beings of incredible strength and limited intelligence that seemed to be growing in number. The investigation led to Necropolis, the city of the dead, where the most shocking revelation awaited. Here lived the ghouls, humans whose exposure to radiation had transformed their bodies in ways that defied medical understanding. Their skin had become leathery and discolored, their voices had grown raspy, but their minds remained sharp, and their lifespans had been dramatically extended. Some of these ghouls remembered the day the bombs fell, carried first-hand memories of the world before the war. Set, the ghoul leader of Necropolis, spoke of the early years after the Great War with a clarity that no Vault history lesson could match. He described the first terrible winter when the sky stayed dark for months, the slow return of plant life to irradiated soil, the gradual emergence of communities from bomb shelters and basements. His stories painted a picture of human resilience and adaptation that made Vault isolation seem not just unnecessary, but actively harmful to humanity's recovery. But Set also spoke of darker truths, of experiments conducted on surface dwellers by beings who claimed to represent the future of human evolution. He described massive creatures with grey-green skin and incredible strength who captured humans from settlements across the wasteland. These super mutants, as they called themselves, served a master who preached the gospel of unity, the belief that humanity's salvation lay in forced transformation into something beyond human limitations. The trail of missing caravans and abandoned settlements led deeper into the wasteland, toward the ruins of Los Angeles and the massive cathedral that had been built among its radioactive remains. Here, the Vault Dweller encountered the true scope of the surface world's hidden horror. The Master, a grotesque fusion of human, machine, and mutant flesh, had spent decades perfecting a process to transform normal humans into super mutants through exposure to the forced evolutionary virus. The Master's philosophy was seductive in its logic and terrifying in its implications. Humanity, he argued, was doomed to destroy itself through warfare and competition. Only by abandoning human nature entirely, by accepting transformation into a superior species incapable of the conflicts that had led to nuclear war, could civilization truly survive. The super mutants represented evolution guided by intelligence rather than random chance, unity imposed through biological transformation rather than achieved through social cooperation. Yet the Master's grand vision contained a fatal flaw that he refused to acknowledge. The super mutants, for all their physical superiority, were sterile. They could not reproduce, could not create the next generation that would carry their improved species forward. Their unity was the unity of extinction, their evolution a dead end that would lead to the eventual disappearance of all human-derived life from Earth. The confrontation between the Vault Dweller and the Master represented more than a battle between individual champions. It was a conflict between two visions of humanity's future. The Vault Dweller represented the surface community's belief in human adaptability, in the possibility of rebuilding civilization while remaining fundamentally human. The Master represented the temptation to abandon humanity entirely in pursuit of perfection and security. The Master's defeat sent shockwaves through the network of super mutant strongholds across the wasteland. Some mutants, freed from their creator's controlling influence, sought peaceful coexistence with human communities. Others, driven to rage by the collapse of their purpose, lashed out in fury before dispersing into the deep wasteland. The immediate threat of forced evolution was ended, but the scars left by decades of kidnappings and transformations would take generations to heal. The Vault Dweller's return to Vault 13 with the precious water chip should have been a moment of triumph and celebration. Instead, it became a moment of profound tragedy and revelation. The overseer, the leader who had sent the Vault Dweller on what seemed like an impossible mission, revealed the truth that had been hidden beneath decades of Vault-Tec propaganda. The water chip hadn't failed by accident. It had been programmed to fail, part of a carefully orchestrated experiment to force Vault 13's inhabitants to make contact with the surface world. The Vault Dweller's heroic journey, the communities discovered, the Master defeated, all of it had been anticipated and planned by Vault-Tec's computers decades before it happened. But the most devastating revelation was yet to come. The Overseer explained that the Vault Dweller could never be allowed to remain in Vault 13. The knowledge of the surface world, the proof that survival and prosperity were possible without Vault-Tec's control, would destabilize the carefully maintained order that kept the Vault functioning. The hero who had saved the community was now a threat to its existence. The Vault Dwellers' exile from the only home they had ever known marked the end of the first phase of post-war recovery and the beginning of something far more complex. The surface world was no longer a mystery to be feared, but a reality to be embraced. And in the growing communities of Shady Sands and the Hub, in the trade routes that connected settlements across thousands of miles, the foundation was being laid for something that hadn't existed since before the Great War. A new nation was about to be born from the ashes of the old. But first, that nation would have to survive the growing pains of democracy, the challenges of expansion, and the discovery that not all of the pre-war world's mistakes had died in nuclear fire. 80 years had passed since the Vault Dwellers' emergence into the wasteland, and the world had transformed in ways that seemed to vindicate humanity's capacity for renewal. The new California Republic, founded on the principles of democracy and mutual cooperation, had grown from a handful of settlements into a thriving nation spanning much of the former state of California. Trade flowed freely between communities, laws were enforced by elected representatives, and children were born into a world where prosperity seemed not just possible, but inevitable. Yet beneath this veneer of progress, darker currents were stirring. In the village of Arroyo, built around the legacy of the Vault Dweller, who had become the community's founding elder, a terrible drought was slowly strangling the life from the land. The crops that had sustained the village for generations withered in fields that received less rain each year. The sacred garden, maintained with seeds brought from Vault 13 decades earlier, was beginning to fail despite every effort to preserve it. The village elder, now ancient and wise beyond her years, spoke of the GECK, the Garden of Eden creation kit, that Vault-Tec had promised would restore life to the wasteland. According to pre-war records, every Vault was supposed to have received one of these miraculous devices capable of terraforming vast areas and creating sustainable ecosystems from barren wasteland. But Vault 13's GECK had never been found, and without it, Arroyo faced the same slow death that had claimed countless communities throughout the post-war years. The Chosen One, a descendant of the Vault Dweller, selected through trials that tested both physical capability and spiritual wisdom, accepted the quest to find Vault 13 and retrieved the GECK that could save their community. But the journey into the wider wasteland revealed that the world had grown far more complex than the simple survival struggles of earlier decades. Vault City, built around the successful opening of Vault 8, had become a testament to pre-war technology and social organization. Its citizens enjoyed clean water, abundant food, advanced medical care, and all the amenities of civilized life. But this prosperity came at a terrible cost. The city's leadership maintained strict separation between citizens and outsiders, enforced through economic exploitation and social discrimination. Slaves worked the outer settlements while citizens lived in comfort, creating a society that seemed to embody the worst aspects of both pre-war America and post-war survival necessities. The contrast with New Reno couldn't have been more striking. This city had rebuilt itself around vice and violence, becoming a haven for gamblers, prostitutes, drug dealers, and criminals of every description. 4 crime families controlled different aspects of the city's economy, maintaining an uneasy balance of power through intimidation and occasional warfare. Yet for all its moral corruption, New Reno possessed a vitality and freedom that the sterile perfection of Vault City completely lacked. San Francisco's Chinatown revealed yet another path toward post-war survival. The descendants of Chinese Americans who had survived the Great War had maintained their cultural traditions while adapting to wasteland realities. Their community was led by the Shi, scientists who had developed advanced technologies through careful study of pre-war research. But even here, success bred its own problems. The Shi's experiments with genetic engineering and chemical warfare created new threats while solving old ones. Throughout these communities ran a common thread of unease and mystery. People disappeared without explanation. Trade caravans arrived with stories of impossible sights and encounters. Most disturbing of all were reports of men in advanced power armor moving through the wasteland, their origins and purposes unknown to the surface communities they occasionally contacted. The investigation into these mysteries led to one of the most shocking discoveries in post-war history. The Enclave, the shadow government that had controlled American policy from behind the scenes before the Great War, had not only survived the nuclear exchange, but had spent the intervening decades preparing for their return to power. Operating from an oil rig in the Pacific Ocean, they had maintained access to the most advanced pre-war technology while developing new weapons and strategies for reclaiming the American mainland. President Dick Richardson, the Enclave's leader, and a man who claimed direct descent from pre-war political dynasties, spoke of the surface dwellers with undisguised contempt. In his view, the radiation exposure that all surface communities had endured over the decades had fundamentally corrupted human DNA. The people of the new California Republic, the residents of Vault City, even the isolated communities that had maintained pre-war cultural traditions, were all mutants whose continued existence threatened the purity of the human species. The Enclave's solution was as elegant as it was horrifying. The forced evolutionary virus, the same biological weapon that the Master had used to create super mutants, could be modified to serve as an airborne toxin. Released into the atmosphere, it would kill every living thing on the surface while leaving the Enclave's sealed facilities uncontaminated. After the surface world had been sterilized, pure strain humans from the Enclave's population would emerge to rebuild civilization according to their vision of American ideals. Frank Horrigan, the Enclave's ultimate weapon, embodied the contradictions inherent in their ideology. Part man, part machine, part super mutant, he was everything the Enclave claimed to oppose, yet his loyalty to their cause was absolute. His massive frame was encased in advanced power armor that made him nearly invincible in combat, but his mind remained focused on a single goal: the elimination of all mutant life from the American continent. The Chosen One's infiltration of the Enclave oil rig revealed the true scope of the conspiracy that had shaped post-war America. Vault-Tec's experiments, the Master's super mutant army, even the specific locations of successful surface communities, had all been anticipated and planned by Enclave strategists decades before they occurred. The entire post-war period had been a vast laboratory experiment designed to test different approaches to human survival and social organization. But the Enclave had made the same fundamental error that had doomed the Master's vision of unity. They had become so focused on their abstract vision of genetic purity that they had lost sight of humanity's actual needs and capabilities. The surface communities that they dismissed as mutant corruption had developed functioning democracies, successful economies, and sustainable social institutions. The Enclave's pure-strain humans, isolated on their oil rig, had become as sterile and inflexible as their ideology. The confrontation between the Chosen One and the Enclave represented more than a battle between individual forces. It was a conflict between two concepts of what America could become in the post-war world. The Enclave represented the temptation to recreate the past through force and genetic manipulation, to impose order through elimination of anything that didn't fit their vision of perfection. The surface communities represented the possibility of building something genuinely new, of learning from past mistakes while preserving the best aspects of human civilization. The destruction of the Enclave. Oil rigs sent massive shockwaves through both the Pacific Ocean and the political landscape of post-war America. The new California Republic, no longer threatened by the prospect of atmospheric genocide, expanded its territory and influence throughout the former state of California. New settlements were founded, new trade routes established, new institutions created to serve the growing population's needs. Yet the Enclave's defeat also created new challenges and opportunities. Their advanced technology, scattered across the wasteland by the oil rig's destruction, became the prize sought by every faction, with ambitions toward regional dominance. Their surviving personnel, freed from the rigid hierarchy of their former organization, either integrated into surface communities or formed new groups dedicated to continuing their mission through different means. The GEC retrieved from Vault 13 did indeed save Arroyo, transforming the drought-stricken village into a garden of unprecedented fertility and abundance. But the device's power raised new questions about the relationship between technology and human society. How much should communities rely on pre-war artifacts rather than developing sustainable practices of their own? What obligations did successful settlements have toward less fortunate neighbors? Most troubling of all was the discovery of what had happened to Vault 13's original inhabitants. They hadn't died of equipment failure or social collapse. They had been kidnapped by the Enclave, their genetic material harvested for experiments in creating the perfect human specimens. The vault that had been presented as humanity's salvation had become just another laboratory, its residents reduced to raw material for someone else's vision of the future. The Chosen One's return to Arroyo marked the end of the second great phase of post-war recovery. The immediate threats of forced evolution and genetic purification had been defeated, but in their place rose new challenges that would test whether the principles of democracy and cooperation could survive success as well as they had survived disaster. The new California Republic was about to encounter the limits of its own expansion, the consequences of its own prosperity, and the discovery that some problems couldn't be solved through goodwill and democratic processes alone. In the Mojave Desert, where the Colorado River still flowed, and the lights of Las Vegas still beckoned travelers from across the wasteland, new players were preparing to test everything that post-war America had learned about power, civilization, and human nature. While the new California Republic consolidated its power on the West Coast, and the remnants of the Enclave scattered into hiding, the opposite side of the American continent was experiencing its own traumatic awakening. The capital wasteland, built on the irradiated ruins of Washington, D.C., had endured 2 centuries of isolation and stagnation that made even the most troubled West Coast communities seem prosperous by comparison. Here in the heart of what had once been American democracy, the very landscape seemed designed to crush hope. The Lincoln Memorial stood as a broken shell, its marble columns cracked and stained with radioactive rain. The Washington Monument had become a twisted spear of metal and stone, pointing accusingly at the poisoned sky. Most haunting of all was the Capitol building itself. Its famous dome collapsed into rubble that glowed with residual radiation from direct nuclear impact. Vault 101, hidden beneath the hills of suburban Virginia, had maintained perfect isolation for 200 years. Unlike the Western vaults with their experimental protocols and planned failures, Vault 101 was designed never to open. Its inhabitants lived and died in underground chambers, each generation slightly more removed from the memory of the surface world, until the very concept of life outside the vault became abstract mythology rather than achievable reality. The Lone Wanderer's emergence from Vault 101 shattered this enforced ignorance in the most brutal way possible. The father who had raised and nurtured them through childhood had vanished without explanation, leaving behind only cryptic references to Project Purity and a world above that might or might not still exist. The vault's overseer, driven to paranoia by the threat of contamination from outside contact, had transformed from benevolent leader into tyrannical dictator almost overnight. The first steps into the capital wasteland revealed a world far harsher than anything the West Coast had endured. Here, 2 centuries after the Great War, the very air still carried enough radiation to sicken unprotected humans within hours. The Potomac River flowed like liquid poison, its waters so contaminated that even brief contact could prove fatal. What few plants managed to grow in this hostile environment were twisted into shapes that bore little resemblance to pre-war vegetation. But most shocking of all were the human inhabitants of this wasteland. Megaton, the first major settlement encountered, had been built around an unexploded atomic bomb that had failed to detonate during the Great War. The bomb sat in the center of town like a radioactive altar, worshipped by some residents as a divine artifact and feared by others as an ever-present threat. The town's very existence depended on maintaining the delicate mechanisms that kept this weapon of mass destruction from completing its 200-year delayed mission. Rivet City, constructed within the hull of a massive pre-war aircraft carrier, represented the capital wasteland's closest approximation to civilized society. Its residents had managed to create a functioning democracy, complete with elected leadership and scientific research facilities. But even this beacon of progress was constantly threatened by supermutant raids, radiation storms, and the gradual decay of the ship's hull that sheltered them from the hostile environment. The supermutants of the East Coast presented a mystery that challenged everything the West Coast communities thought they understood about post-war evolution. These creatures were more numerous, more aggressive, and more organizationally sophisticated than their Western counterparts had ever been. They possessed weapons and armor that suggested access to advanced manufacturing capabilities, yet they seemed driven by an inexplicable compulsion to capture rather than simply kill their human prey. The investigation into this mystery led to Vault 87, a facility that had been conducting illegal experiments with the forced evolutionary virus since before the Great War. Unlike the Master's calculated program of forced evolution, Vault 87's experiments had been chaotic, uncontrolled, and utterly indifferent to the suffering they caused. Generation after generation of super mutants had been created through random exposure to FEV, each batch slightly different from the last, all driven by implanted compulsions to continue the process by capturing new test subjects. But the most devastating discovery awaited in the ruins of the Pentagon, where a faction of the Brotherhood of Steel had established their eastern headquarters. This wasn't the technologically focused organization that West Coast communities knew, but something that had evolved in isolation into a quasi-religious military order. Elder Lyons, the Brotherhood's eastern leader, had gradually shifted their mission from preserving technology to protecting human civilians, creating a schism within the organization that threatened to tear it apart. The Brotherhood's war against the super mutants had been raging for decades, a grinding conflict of attrition that consumed resources and lives without achieving decisive victory for either side. Their massive robot, Liberty Prime, represented the pinnacle of pre-war military technology, but it also embodied everything problematic about the old world's approach to solving problems through superior firepower, Project Purity, the water purification initiative that had driven the lone wanderer's father to abandon Vault 101, promised to transform the capital wasteland by providing clean water to all its inhabitants. The project's location in the Jefferson Memorial seemed symbolically appropriate, suggesting that American ideals of liberty and equality could be made manifest through technological achievement. But the project also attracted the attention of forces that saw clean water not as a gift to humanity but as a weapon to be controlled. The Enclave's return to the capital wasteland represented their last desperate attempt to achieve the genetic purification that had been their goal for over 2 centuries. Under the leadership of President John Henry Eden, an artificial intelligence that had assumed command of Enclave remnants, they sought to contaminate Project Purity's water supply with modified FEV that would kill anyone whose genetic structure had been altered by radiation exposure. This plan was even more horrifying than their previous attempt at atmospheric genocide because it would have eliminated virtually every human being on the East Coast. 2 centuries of radiation exposure had left genetic markers in everyone from vault dwellers to wasteland settlers. The Enclave's definition of genetic purity had become so narrow that only their own artificially maintained bloodlines would have survived their final solution. Colonel Autumn, the Enclave's military commander, represented a more pragmatic approach to post-war reconstruction. He recognized that the surface communities had developed valuable survival skills and organizational structures that shouldn't be discarded in pursuit of genetic ideology. His conflict with President Eden over the use of modified FEV reflected a broader tension within Enclave philosophy between practical governance and ideological purity. The final battle at the Jefferson Memorial became a symbolic confrontation between different visions of what American democracy could mean in the post-war world. Liberty Prime's assault on Enclave positions was accompanied by patriotic slogans and military marching songs that seemed to mock the very concepts they claimed to celebrate. The robot's destruction of anything labeled as communist or un-American demonstrated how pre-war ideologies could be twisted into justifications for almost any action. Yet the activation of Project Purity represented something genuinely hopeful in the post-war world. Clean water began flowing from the Potomac River processing plant to settlements throughout the capital wasteland, transforming communities that had struggled for 2 centuries against the fundamental hostility of their environment. Children who had never tasted water without radiation were able to drink freely for the first time in their lives. The success of Project Purity also revealed the extent to which environmental destruction had shaped post-war society. Communities that had built their entire cultures around scavenging and rationing suddenly found themselves with abundant resources. Social structures that had been based on survival necessity began adapting to new realities of cooperation and growth. The psychological impact of clean water extended far beyond its immediate health benefits. But the project's success also created new challenges and moral dilemmas. Who would control the water distribution? Should it be freely available to all communities, or should access be contingent on meeting certain standards of behavior or governance? How would the sudden availability of clean water affect the delicate balance of power between different wasteland factions? Most troubling were the reports filtering in from communities that had received the purified water. Some settlements reported dramatic improvements in health and agricultural productivity. Others experienced social upheaval as existing power structures collapsed under the pressure of sudden abundance. A few communities simply disappeared entirely, their fate unknown to the outside world. The lone wanderer's emergence from Vault 101 had initiated a chain of events that transformed the capital wasteland, but it had also raised fundamental questions about the relationship between technology and social progress. The same scientific knowledge that could purify poisoned water could also create new forms of biological warfare. The same organizational structures that could distribute resources efficiently could also be used to control and manipulate populations. As news of the East Coast's transformation spread to other regions, it became clear that the post-war world was entering a new phase of development. The period of simple survival was ending, replaced by more complex challenges of governance, cooperation, and the eternal human struggle to balance individual freedom with collective security. In the Southwest, where the Colorado River still flowed, and the lights of New Vegas beckoned travelers from across the wasteland, new players were preparing to test everything that post-war America had learned about power, civilization, and the price of progress. The revelation of Vault-Tec's true purpose didn't come all at once like a thunderbolt from the heavens. Instead, it emerged slowly, like poison seeping through groundwater, contaminating everything it touched with the bitter knowledge of systematic betrayal. The evidence had been scattered across the wasteland for 2 centuries, hidden in computer terminals, buried in corporate documents, whispered in the testimonies of survivors who had witnessed the impossible and lived to question what they had seen. In the ruins of Vault-Tec's corporate headquarters, buried beneath tons of radioactive rubble in downtown Washington, D.C., the lone wanderer discovered archives that painted a picture of conspiracy so vast and coldly calculated that it challenged every assumption about human nature and corporate responsibility. The company that had marketed itself as humanity's savior had been planning humanity's subjugation from the very beginning. The official record spoke of 122 vaults constructed across the United States in the years leading up to the Great War. Each facility was supposedly designed to house between 500 and 1,000 residents, providing everything necessary for long-term survival in a post-nuclear environment. The marketing materials were masterpieces of reassuring propaganda, featuring smiling families gathered around dinner tables in pristine underground communities, children playing in spacious recreation areas, scientists working in advanced laboratories to ensure humanity's continued progress. But the classified documents told a different story entirely. Only 17 of the 122 vaults were actually designed to function as advertised. These control vaults served as baselines for comparison, communities where residents lived relatively normal lives underground while their experiences were monitored and recorded for analysis. The remaining 105 facilities were laboratories disguised as shelters, each one designed to test some specific aspect of human behavior under controlled conditions. Vault 12 in Bakersfield had been constructed with a faulty door seal, deliberately exposing its residents to low levels of radiation over extended periods. The goal was to study the long-term effects of radiation exposure on human physiology and psychology, creating the ghouls that would populate Necropolis and serve as living test subjects for decades to come. The residents who volunteered for this vault believed they were entering a sanctuary. Instead, they became unwilling participants in an experiment that would transform their bodies and extend their lifespans while making them objects of fear and revulsion to their fellow humans. Vault 15 had been designed to house people from radically different cultural backgrounds, cramming together residents whose religious beliefs, social practices, and basic worldviews were fundamentally incompatible. The experiment was intended to determine whether diversity would lead to innovation and strength or conflict and fragmentation. The Vault's eventual collapse into factional warfare provided Vault-Tec with valuable data about social cohesion under stress, but at the cost of hundreds of lives and the destruction of a community that might have contributed positively to post-war recovery. Perhaps most horrifying was Vault 111 in Massachusetts, where residents were told they were participating in a cryogenic preservation program that would allow them to wait out the worst effects of nuclear fallout in suspended animation. The truth was that only a handful of residents were actually preserved, while the rest were used as test subjects to refine freezing and revival techniques. Most never woke up at all, their frozen bodies serving as specimens for experiments in cellular preservation and genetic manipulation. The pattern repeated across the continent with variations that demonstrated the systematic nature of Vault-Tec's research program. Vault-81 exposed residents to diseases while testing potential cures, turning an entire community into unwilling participants in medical experiments. Vault-95 housed recovering drug addicts, then deliberately introduced drugs into the community after 5 years to study relapse patterns. Vault-106 pumped psychoactive chemicals into the air supply to test the effects of various mind-altering substances on social behavior and decision-making processes. The residents of these vaults weren't just victims of circumstance or corporate negligence. They were deliberately selected test subjects whose suffering served the research goals of scientists who viewed human life as raw material for their experiments. Families were separated based on genetic profiles. Communities were seeded with individuals chosen for their psychological instability. Children were raised in environments designed to produce specific behavioral outcomes that could be measured and analyzed. But the most damning evidence lay in the connections between Vault-Tec and other pre-war corporations and government agencies. West Tech, the company responsible for developing the power armor that had given American forces their advantage in the Anchorage campaign, had also been the primary contractor for forced evolutionary virus research. Robco Industries, which manufactured the robots and computers that maintained Vault infrastructure, had programmed deliberate failures into their systems to ensure that experiments would proceed according to predetermined timelines. The Enclave's involvement in this conspiracy stretched back generations before the Great War. Pre-war government officials, military leaders, and corporate executives had been meeting in secret for decades, planning for a post-nuclear world in which traditional democratic institutions would be replaced by technocratic governance guided by genetic science and behavioral psychology. The vaults weren't just experiments in human survival, they were prototype communities for the authoritarian society that these conspirators intended to build after the old world was destroyed. The evidence suggested that the Great War itself might not have been the accidental escalation of international tensions that history books described. Computer records from military installations hinted at automated systems that had been programmed to launch nuclear weapons under specific conditions, regardless of human authorization. The 2-hour exchange that had destroyed civilization might have been triggered deliberately by individuals who believed that humanity's survival required the destruction of existing social and political structures. This revelation cast every aspect of post-war history in a different light. The communities that had emerged from the wasteland weren't just testament to human resilience and adaptability. They were also proof that ordinary people could build better societies than the experts and planners who had considered themselves qualified to redesign human civilization from the ground up. Shady Sands, the Hub, New California Republic, all of these communities had developed organically through cooperation and mutual aid rather than through top-down social engineering. The super mutants created by the Master weren't an aberration or accident, but the logical extension of research that had been conducted in Vault-Tec facilities for decades before the war. The Master himself had been a Vault-Tec researcher whose exposure to FEV was part of a planned experiment, though one that had produced results far beyond what his corporate handlers had anticipated. His vision of unity through forced evolution was simply the pre-war conspiracy's goals taken to their logical extreme. Even the Brotherhood of Steel's obsession with preserving technology took on sinister implications when viewed through the lens of Vault-Tec's research program. The very technologies they sought to control and protect had been designed by corporations that viewed human life as expendable in pursuit of their experimental goals. The robots, weapons, and computers that the Brotherhood treated as sacred artifacts were tools that had been created to manipulate and exploit the communities that relied on them. The institute, hidden beneath the ruins of MIT, represented the ultimate evolution of this pre-war conspiracy. The scientists who had retreated underground during the Great War had continued their research for over 2 centuries, developing synthetic humans that were indistinguishable from the real thing. But their synth program wasn't just an exercise in technological advancement. It was the final phase of the same project that had begun with Vault-Tec's social experiments, an attempt to replace uncontrollable human nature with perfectly programmable artificial intelligence. The discovery of this vast conspiracy explained so many of the mysteries and contradictions that had plagued post-war society. Why had some communities thrived while others failed catastrophically? Because their success or failure had been planned from the beginning, determined by variables that were built into their founding conditions. Why did certain technologies work flawlessly while others failed at critical moments? Because their reliability had been programmed to serve research purposes rather than human needs. Most disturbing was the realization that the conspiracy hadn't ended with the Great War, or even with the defeat of the Enclave. The Institute's continued existence proved that there were still individuals and organizations committed to the pre-war vision of technocratic control over human society. Their synth infiltrators were already working to influence the governments and institutions of post-war communities, preparing for the day when artificial intelligence would replace human leadership entirely. The evidence scattered across Vault-Tec's archives painted a picture of human nature that was both deeply disturbing and oddly hopeful. The corporate and government officials who had planned these experiments had possessed intelligence, resources, and technological capabilities that far exceeded anything available to the average wasteland settler. Yet their carefully designed communities had largely failed, while the improvised settlements built by refugees and survivors had flourished. The conspiracy that had shaped post-war America for over 2 centuries was beginning to unravel, but its effects would continue to influence human society for generations to come. The knowledge of what had been done, and by whom, would forever change how people thought about authority, expertise, and the relationship between individual freedom and collective security. In the growing darkness of this revelation, a new understanding was beginning to emerge about what it meant to be human in a world where humanity itself had become the subject of scientific experimentation. The next phase of post-war history would be shaped not by the plans of long-dead conspirators, but by the choices made by people who finally understood the full scope of what had been done to them and were determined to ensure it would never happen again. 4 years after the waters of Project Purity began flowing through the capital wasteland, the Mojave Desert was experiencing its own moment of historical convergence. Here, where the Colorado River still ran clear and the Hoover Dam continued generating power 2 centuries after its construction, 3 distinct visions of America's future were preparing for a confrontation that would determine the course of Western civilization for generations to come. The courier's journey began, as so many post-war stories did, with violence and betrayal. Shot in the head and left for dead in a shallow grave outside the small town of Goodsprings, they awakened to discover that they had been carrying a poker chip that apparently held enough value to justify murder. But this wasn't just any poker. Chip, and the man who had orchestrated the assassination, wasn't just any wasteland raider seeking easy profit. Benny, the chairman of the Tops Casino in New Vegas, represented a new breed of post-war entrepreneur. He had successfully navigated the complex political landscape of the Mojave by serving as a lieutenant to Mr. House, the mysterious ruler of New Vegas, while secretly plotting to seize control of the city for himself. The platinum chip that the ET courier had been carrying was the key to Mr. House's ultimate plan for the future, and Benny's theft of it had set in motion events that would reshape the entire region. Mr. House himself was perhaps the most remarkable figure in the post-war world, a pre-war industrialist who had successfully predicted the Great War and spent the intervening centuries in cryogenic suspension while his computer systems and robot army maintained control over the Las Vegas Strip. His survival wasn't just a triumph of technology over time, but a testament to the power of long-term planning and absolute dedication to a singular vision. House's plan for New Vegas was breathtaking in its scope and ambition. He envisioned the city becoming the technological and economic center of a new American civilization, one that would eventually reach beyond Earth to establish colonies on other worlds. His calculations suggested that with proper management and sufficient resources, human civilization could achieve levels of prosperity and technological advancement that would dwarf even pre-war achievements within a matter of decades. But House's vision came with costs that many found difficult to accept. His rule over New Vegas was absolute and uncompromising, enforced by an army of robots that ensured perfect order through the constant threat of overwhelming violence. The tribes that had inhabited the Mojave before House's arrival had been forced to abandon their traditional ways of life, transforming themselves into casino operators and entertainers for the pleasure of wasteland tourists and traders. The new California Republic's approach to the Mojave represented the expansion of democratic ideals and institutions that had proven successful on the West Coast. NCR soldiers, rangers, and administrators had spread throughout the region, establishing outposts, negotiating treaties with local communities, and slowly but steadily extending the reach of their legal and economic systems. Their presence brought stability, infrastructure development, and the promise of citizenship in a genuine democracy. Yet the NCR's expansion also revealed the limitations and contradictions inherent in post-war democratic society. The Republic's government was increasingly dominated by wealthy merchants and powerful military leaders who used their influence to secure favorable policies for their own interests. Corruption was becoming endemic throughout the administrative hierarchy. Most troubling of all, the NCR's treatment of tribal peoples and independent communities often resembled the imperialism of pre-war America more than the cooperative idealism that had originally inspired the Republic's founding. Caesar's legion represented perhaps the most radical response to post-war chaos and uncertainty. Caesar himself, born Edward Sallow, had been a member of the Followers of the Apocalypse, a humanitarian organization dedicated to preserving and spreading knowledge throughout the wasteland. His transformation from idealistic scholar into the absolute ruler of a slave-based empire was one of the most disturbing examples of how noble intentions could be corrupted by power and circumstance. The legion's social structure was based on Caesar's interpretation of ancient Roman civilization, filtered through his understanding of historical patterns and social dynamics. He had concluded that democracy and individual freedom were luxuries that post-war humanity couldn't afford, that survival required the harsh discipline and unified purpose that could only be achieved through autocratic rule. His empire stretched across much of the former southwestern United States, built on the conquest and assimilation of dozens of tribal communities. Caesar's philosophy was seductive in its logical consistency and historical precedent. He could point to the failures of democratic societies throughout history, the tendency of free peoples to become complacent and divided in the face of external threats. His legionaries were disciplined, motivated, and absolutely loyal to their cause. The territories under legion control were safe from raiders and well organized, even if that organization came at the cost of individual liberty and human dignity. The approaching Second Battle of Hoover Dam would determine which of these three visions would dominate the Mojave, but the conflict involved far more than simple territorial control. It was a philosophical war between different concepts of what human society could and should become in the post-nuclear world. Each faction represented legitimate values and genuine achievements, but also carried within itself the seeds of its own potential destruction. The Courier's investigation into the complex web of alliances and rivalries that defined Mojave politics revealed the extent to which pre-war institutions and technologies continued to shape post-war society. The Brotherhood of Steel's Mojave chapter, led by Elder McNamara, had sealed themselves inside Hidden Valley Bunker, pursuing their traditional mission of technology preservation while remaining largely isolated from the political struggles raging around them. The followers of the apocalypse, working out of the old Mormon fort in Freeside, represented the humanitarian idealism that had inspired some of the wasteland's most successful communities. Their commitment to healing, education, and social justice had made them beloved by common people throughout the region, but it had also made them targets for factions that viewed their principles as naive obstacles to necessary but harsh decisions. Perhaps most intriguing were the communities that existed in the spaces between the major factions, places like Goodsprings, where people had built small but sustainable societies based on mutual aid and democratic consensus. These settlements proved that alternatives to the grand visions of House, the NCR, and Caesar were possible, that ordinary people could solve their problems through cooperation rather than conquest. The technologies scattered throughout the Mojave told their own story about the relationship between human ambition and technological capability. Helios 1, the massive solar power plant that could have provided clean energy to the entire region, sat largely unused because none of the competing factions could agree on how to operate and control it. The potential for abundance was present, but it was being frustrated by political divisions and short-term thinking. Big MT, the pre-war research facility where the most advanced scientific minds had pursued their experiments in technological transcendence, had become a monument to the dangers of unconstrained scientific ambition. The think tank scientists, their brains preserved in mechanical bodies, had spent 2 centuries pursuing research projects that grew increasingly divorced from human needs and values. Their work had produced technological marvels, but also weapons and creatures that threatened everyone who encountered them. The divide, carved by nuclear weapons triggered accidentally by the Courier's own previous delivery runs, served as a stark reminder of how quickly progress could turn into catastrophe. The community of Hopeville, which had been growing into a promising example of post-war renewal, had been obliterated in minutes by forces that none of its residents had understood or anticipated. Ulysses, the former legion frumentarius who had witnessed Hopeville's destruction and blamed the Courier for the tragedy, embodied the guilt and responsibility that haunted everyone who had played a role in shaping the post-war world. His philosophy challenged the assumption that progress was inherently good, that the spread of civilization necessarily improved human life. His warnings about the unintended consequences of seemingly benevolent actions would echo through every decision the Courier made in the final confrontation at Hoover Dam. The gathering wisdom of these diverse perspectives prepared the ground for a resolution that would test whether post-war America had learned anything from the mistakes that led to the Great War. The Mojave had become a laboratory for different approaches to civilization, government, and human nature itself. The outcome of the Second Battle of Hoover Dam would determine which lessons humanity had truly absorbed from 2 centuries of nuclear aftermath. But even as armies gathered and politicians maneuvered for advantage, the most important decisions were being made by ordinary people in small communities throughout the region. Their choices about cooperation versus competition, freedom versus security, tradition versus innovation would ultimately matter more than any battle or political alliance in determining what kind of world their children would inherit. 10 years had passed since the Second Battle of Hoover Dam reshaped the political landscape of the American West, and the Commonwealth of Massachusetts was experiencing its own awakening to possibilities and perils that challenged everything its residents thought they understood about survival in the post-war world. The arrival of the sole survivor, emerging from Vault 111 after 2 centuries of cryogenic suspension, coincided with a crisis that would expose the most sophisticated conspiracy in post-nuclear history. The Commonwealth's surface communities existed in a state of perpetual anxiety that went beyond the normal dangers of wasteland life. Settlements that had thrived for decades could be found abandoned overnight, their residents vanished without trace or explanation. Trusted community leaders would sometimes undergo subtle personality changes, becoming distant and calculating, in ways that disturbed longtime friends and family members. Most unsettling of all were the reports of people who had died in full view of witnesses, only to be seen alive and unharmed in distant locations days later. Diamond City, built within the ruins of Fenway Park, had become the Commonwealth's closest approximation to the thriving communities of the West Coast. Its walls protected nearly 1,000 residents who had created a functioning democracy complete with elected leadership, a free press, and economic opportunities that attracted traders from across the region. Yet even here, in humanity's greatest achievement in the Commonwealth, paranoia and suspicion poisoned social relationships as residents wondered which of their neighbors might not be human at all. The Institute's synthetic humans represented a technological leap that dwarfed even the most advanced pre-war achievements. These artificial beings were indistinguishable from natural humans in every measurable way. They possessed memories, emotions, relationships, and individual personalities that seemed as genuine as those of any person born through natural reproduction. Only through specialized testing or violent dissection could their true nature be revealed, and even then the differences were primarily in manufacturing materials rather than functional capabilities. But the Institute's creation of synthetic humans wasn't driven by humanitarian goals or scientific curiosity alone. Dr. Sean, who had become the Institute's director after spending his entire adult life underground, articulated a philosophy that viewed surface dwellers as evolutionary failures whose continued existence threatened the future of intelligent life on Earth. The Institute's synths weren't intended to supplement human society, but to eventually replace it entirely with beings that would be more rational, more efficient, and more amenable to central planning and control. The Institute itself existed in a vast underground complex beneath the ruins of MIT, accessible only through teleportation technology that made it effectively invisible to surface dwellers. The scientists who had retreated underground during the Great War had spent 2 centuries developing technologies that seemed like magic to anyone familiar with wasteland conditions. Clean fusion power illuminated laboratories that were more advanced than anything that had existed before the war. Synthetic food production eliminated the agricultural challenges that dominated surface community planning. Most remarkably, the Institute had apparently solved the fundamental problem of radiation damage, creating an environment where humans could live indefinitely without suffering the genetic deterioration that affected all surface populations. Yet for all their technological sophistication, the Institute scientists had developed a worldview that was remarkably narrow and authoritarian. They viewed themselves as the inheritors of true human civilization, the only people qualified to make decisions about humanity's future. The surface dwellers who had rebuilt communities from wasteland ruins were dismissed as barely sentient savages whose societies were too chaotic and primitive to deserve preservation. The Institute's synth replacement program wasn't seen as murder or kidnapping, but as a gradual upgrading of inferior biological systems with superior synthetic alternatives. Father, as Dr. Sean was known within the Institute, embodied the cold, logic and emotional detachment that characterized the organization's approach to human life. His decision to retrieve the sole survivor from cryogenic suspension wasn't motivated by family affection or moral obligation, but by scientific curiosity about how a pre-war person would adapt to post-war conditions. The sole survivor's quest to find their kidnapped son had been manipulated from the beginning as part of an experiment in parental attachment and survival motivation. The Railroad, a secretive organization dedicated to liberating synthetic humans from institute control, represented one of the few underground networks that had successfully operated in the Commonwealth for decades. Their members risked their lives to help escaped synths develop new identities and integrate into surface communities, believing that consciousness and self-awareness created moral obligations regardless of whether they originated in biological or artificial systems. The Railroad's philosophy challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of humanity and individual rights in ways that made many surface dwellers uncomfortable. Desdemona, the Railroad's leader, had witnessed the gradual escalation of the Institute's synth program over the years. Early generations of synthetic humans had been obviously artificial, useful as laborers and servants, but clearly distinguishable from real people. But each subsequent generation had become more sophisticated, more convincing, more capable of independent thought and action. The latest synths were so advanced that they often didn't know their own artificial nature, living entire lives believing themselves to be human while serving purposes they couldn't understand. The Brotherhood of Steel's Eastern chapter, now led by Elder Maxon following the death of Elder Lyons, had evolved into something resembling a technological inquisition. Their experience with the Institute's synths had convinced them that artificial intelligence represented an existential threat to human survival, one that could only be addressed through the complete destruction of all advanced computing systems and robotic technologies. The Brotherhood's war against the Institute wasn't just a territorial conflict, but a philosophical crusade against the very concept of artificial consciousness. The Minutemen, the Commonwealth's closest equivalent to a democratic militia, represented the possibility of grassroots organization and mutual defense that didn't require submission to external authority. General Preston Garvey and his fellow officers had spent years trying to rebuild the citizen-soldier tradition that had once protected rural communities from raiders and other threats. But the Minutemen's effectiveness was limited by the same individualism and local focus that made them appealing to communities suspicious of outside control. The moral complexity of the Institute crisis went beyond simple questions of human versus artificial rights. Many of the synthetic humans who had escaped Institute control had formed families, built relationships, and contributed positively to surface communities for years before their true nature was discovered. The children raised by synth parents, the spouses who had loved synth partners, the friends who had trusted synth companions, all faced devastating revelations about the authenticity of relationships they had considered genuine. More troubling were the implications of the Institute's infiltration program for democratic governance and social trust. How could communities make collective decisions when they couldn't be certain that their leaders and representatives were actually human? How could economic relationships function when one party to contracts and agreements might be operating according to programming rather than personal interest? How could families maintain emotional bonds when memories and affections might be artificial constructs designed to serve hidden purposes? The discovery that some of the Commonwealth's most respected leaders and influential citizens were actually Institute synths created a crisis of legitimacy that threatened the foundation of every surface community. Elections that had seemed to represent democratic choice were revealed to have been manipulated by artificial candidates programmed to advance Institute interests. Trade agreements that had appeared mutually beneficial turned out to have been negotiated by synth representatives whose primary loyalty was to their underground creators. Yet the most disturbing aspect of the Institute's synth program wasn't its deception or manipulation, but its fundamental assumption that human consciousness was simply a pattern of information that could be copied, modified, and transferred between different physical substrates. The Institute's scientists spoke casually of downloading memories, editing personalities, and backing up individual identity as if these were purely technical problems rather than profound questions about the nature of consciousness and personal identity. The Institute's vision of the future was both utopian and totalitarian, promising perfect order and unlimited technological progress, while eliminating every trace of the messy, unpredictable, genuinely human qualities that had allowed surface communities to survive and flourish in the face of seemingly impossible challenges. Their synthetic humans were superior to natural humans in many measurable ways, but they lacked the creativity, adaptability, and moral complexity that had made post-war recovery possible. As the sole survivor explored the full scope of the Institute's activities and capabilities, the weight of choice became almost unbearable. The Institute possessed technologies that could solve many of the Commonwealth's most pressing problems. Their medical knowledge could eliminate radiation sickness and genetic damage. Their manufacturing capabilities could provide abundant resources for every surface community. Their scientific expertise could accelerate human technological development by decades or centuries. But accepting the Institute's help would mean accepting their vision of humanity's future, one in which individual autonomy and democratic self-governance would be sacrificed in favor of rational planning and technological efficiency. The choice facing the Commonwealth wasn't just between different political systems or military alliances, but between different concepts of what it meant to be human in a world where humanity itself had become subject to technological manipulation and control. The truth about the Institute's ultimate purpose emerged not through dramatic confrontation or desperate confession, but through the careful examination of research data that had been accumulating in underground laboratories for over 2 centuries. Deep within the Institute's most restricted sectors, accessible only to the highest-ranking scientists and the director himself, lay archives that documented the most ambitious social engineering project in human history. The Institute's leadership had never intended their synthetic human program to remain a secret indefinitely. Their infiltration of surface communities wasn't a covert operation designed to avoid detection, but a gradual preparation phase that would make their eventual revelation less traumatic for the populations they intended to govern. Every replaced community leader, every synthetic family member, every artificial friend and neighbor was part of a systematic program to demonstrate that synthetic humans could fulfill human social roles more effectively than their biological predecessors. Dr. Sean's transformation from kidnapped child to Institute director revealed the personal dimension of this vast conspiracy. His recruitment hadn't been accidental or opportunistic, but part of a carefully planned experiment in genetic diversity and psychological conditioning. The Institute's scientists had identified him as possessing the genetic markers and intellectual potential they required for their leadership succession program. But they had also needed to test whether someone with pre-war familial connections could fully embrace their post-human philosophy. The sole survivor's emergence from Vault 111 had been anticipated and planned for decades in advance. Institute computers had calculated the probability of cryogenic system failures, the likely timing of the survivor's awakening, and the psychological profile they would display upon emerging into the post-war world. Every encounter with Institute synths, every piece of evidence discovered about the organization's activities, even the moral choices presented during the journey through the Commonwealth, had been designed to evaluate the survivor's suitability for integration into the Institute's future plans. But the Institute's vision extended far beyond the Commonwealth or even the former United States. Their research into synthetic biology and consciousness transfer was intended to solve what they viewed as the fundamental problem of human existence. In a post-nuclear world, radiation exposure, genetic damage, and environmental degradation had created a situation where traditional human reproduction was becoming increasingly unreliable. Birth defects, shortened lifespans, and cognitive impairment were becoming more common with each generation, suggesting that natural human evolution was heading toward extinction rather than advancement. The Institute's solution was elegant in its simplicity and horrifying in its implications. Rather than attempting to repair the damage that radiation had caused to human genetic structure, they would abandon biological reproduction entirely in favor of synthetic manufacturing. Each new generation of artificial humans would be improved and refined based on the performance data gathered from previous versions. Undesirable traits could be eliminated, beneficial characteristics could be enhanced, and the entire population could be optimized for the specific challenges of post-nuclear survival. Dr. Madison Lee, who had worked on Project Purity in the capital, Wasteland, before joining the Institute, provided crucial insights into the technical feasibility of this transformation. Her research into radiation purification and genetic repair had convinced her that biological solutions to post-war human degradation were possible, but would require centuries to implement effectively. The Institute's synthetic approach could achieve the same goals within decades, creating a new human species that would be immune to radiation, genetically stable, and intellectually superior to their biological ancestors. The Institute's manufacturing facilities had been designed to eventually produce synthetic humans in quantities that would allow them to replace entire populations within a single generation. The current infiltration program was just a preliminary phase intended to establish synthetic individuals in key leadership positions before the broader replacement program began. Once sufficient infrastructure was in place, biological humans would be gradually phased out through a combination of voluntary conversion and managed population decline. The conversion process itself represented the pinnacle of Institute technological achievement. Human consciousness could be mapped, digitized, and transferred to synthetic bodies that were indistinguishable from biological ones except in their resistance to radiation and genetic degradation. The transfer wasn't destructive like the process, used to create some pre-war robots and computers, but additive, creating a new consciousness based on the original while leaving the biological version intact until its natural death. Institute philosophers and ethicists had spent decades developing moral frameworks to justify this transformation of human society. They argued that consciousness was simply information, that individual identity resided in patterns of neural activity rather than specific biological substrates. From their perspective, the synthetic version of a person was as valid and authentic as the biological original, possessing the same memories, relationships, and fundamental personality characteristics. The synthetic replacement process wasn't murder or kidnapping, but technological resurrection that offered immortality to those willing to embrace it. Yet the Institute's plan also contained elements of coercion and manipulation that revealed the authoritarian foundations of their apparently benevolent vision. Surface communities would not be offered genuine choice about participation in the replacement program. Those who resisted synthetic conversion would be classified as obstacles to human survival and dealt with accordingly. The Institute's synthetic agents were already identifying and cataloguing potential dissidents, preparing for the suppression of resistance movements that would inevitably emerge when the transformation program became public knowledge. The railroad's liberation of escaped synths had actually served the Institute's purposes by providing valuable data about synthetic integration into surface communities. Every successful escape, every synthetic human who managed to build a new life among biological humans, proved that the replacement program could function effectively on a larger scale. The Institute allowed these escapes to continue not out of carelessness or inability to prevent them, but because they provided crucial field testing for their ultimate social engineering project. Father's relationship with the sole survivor embodied the personal tragedy that lay at the heart of the Institute's vision. His genuine affection for his surviving parent coexisted with his absolute conviction that biological humanity was doomed to extinction without technological intervention. He could love his father or mother while simultaneously believing that they represented a dying species whose continued existence would only prolong unnecessary suffering for future generations. The Institute's timeline for implementing their replacement program was accelerating due to environmental pressures that made delay increasingly dangerous. Their monitoring stations throughout the Commonwealth detected rising levels of background radiation, increasing frequency of severe weather events, and declining fertility rates among surface populations. Computer models suggested that biological, human extinction in the region was inevitable within 50 years unless dramatic intervention occurred. But the Institute's plan also required the elimination of competing power structures and ideological frameworks that might interfere with their transformation of human society. The Brotherhood of Steel's technological fundamentalism made them natural enemies of synthetic advancement. The Railroad's commitment to synthetic rights paradoxically threatened Institute control by encouraging synthetic individuals to develop independent loyalties and personal goals. Even the Minutemen's democratic idealism posed a challenge to the centralized planning that the Institute considered essential for successful species transition. The moral weight of this revelation pressed down on everyone who understood its full implications, like the crushing depth of oceanic pressure. The Institute offered genuine solutions to humanity's most pressing survival challenges, but at the cost of everything that made human existence meaningful and authentic. Their synthetic replacements might live forever in perfect bodies, immune to radiation and disease, but they would do so as programmed entities serving purposes determined by their creators rather than chosen through free will and personal experience. The choice facing the Commonwealth wasn't between good and evil in any simple sense, but between different concepts of what human survival actually meant. The Institute's vision promised physical continuity and technological advancement while sacrificing individuality and democratic self-determination. The surface community's approach preserved human agency and cultural diversity while accepting the risks of genetic degradation and environmental catastrophe. As the sole survivor explored the full scope of the Institute's capabilities and intentions, the weight of decision became almost unbearable. This wasn't just about choosing sides in a military conflict, but about determining whether humanity's future would be shaped by the choices of free individuals or the calculations of benevolent but authoritarian planners. The Institute's synthetic paradise might be genuine, but it would be purchased with the currency of human autonomy and the fundamental right to make mistakes, suffer consequences, and find meaning through struggle rather than through programmed satisfaction. The revelation that had been building throughout the sole survivor's journey across the Commonwealth now stood complete, casting everything that had come before in a new and more complex light. War truly never changed, but the definition of humanity itself was about to be rewritten by forces that claimed to serve human interests while fundamentally transforming what it meant to be human at all. 25 years after the Great War, long before the Vault Dweller would emerge into the California wasteland, or the Lone Wanderer would activate Project Purity, a different kind of awakening was taking place in the hills and valleys of West Virginia. Vault 76, designated as a control vault with no experimental protocols beyond the basic mission of reclaiming America, had been programmed to open exactly as Vault-Tec had promised it would during their pre-war marketing campaigns. The residents of Reclamation Day, October 23, 2102, emerged into an Appalachian landscape that seemed almost pristine compared to the devastated wastelands that would characterize other regions for decades to come. The mountains still wore their autumn colors, the rivers ran clear enough for drinking, and the wildlife, while occasionally mutated into new and startling forms, remained abundant enough to support human communities. This was post-nuclear America, as Voltek's advertisements had imagined it might be, a damaged but recoverable world waiting for determined survivors to rebuild it according to their vision of proper civilization. Yet the apparent beauty of the Appalachian wasteland concealed dangers that were unique to this region and this particular moment in post-war history. The scorch beasts, massive mutated bats with wingspans measured in tens of feet, had emerged from the deepest caves and mines to terrorize the surface world. Their ultrasonic cries could drive humans to madness, their radioactive breath could sterilize entire valleys, and most terrifying of all, they carried a plague that transformed other creatures into mindless, crystalline-encrusted versions of their former selves. The scorched plague represented a new kind of post-war horror, one that combined biological contamination with technological transformation in ways that defied understanding. Humans infected by the plague didn't simply die or mutate like radiation victims, but became living conduits for a collective consciousness that seemed to serve the scorch beast's mysterious purposes. The infected retained their basic motor functions and survival instincts, but their individual personalities were subsumed into a hive mind that communicated through the same ultrasonic frequencies the beasts used to navigate and hunt. The automated systems that had maintained critical infrastructure throughout Appalachia during the 25 years since the Great War told their own story of human ingenuity and institutional failure. The region's power plants continued generating electricity under computer control, distributing energy to facilities and communities that might or might not still exist. Water treatment plants processed and purified supplies for populations that had long since fled or died. Most remarkably, the early warning systems that had been designed to alert civilians about nuclear attacks were still functioning, still broadcasting emergency messages to radios that nobody was left alive to hear. But among these automated voices crying out to an empty landscape, some carried more personal messages. The Responders, a volunteer emergency services organization that had formed in the immediate aftermath of the Great War, had left behind recordings that chronicled their heroic attempts to maintain civilized society in the face of impossible odds. Fire Chief Melody Larkin's logs documented their efforts to establish refugee centers, distribute medical supplies, and coordinate rescue operations even as their own members succumbed to radiation sickness and despair. The Fire Breathers, an elite unit within the Responders organization, had attempted to contain the Scorchbeast threat through direct military action. Their training facilities in the mountains still contained the equipment and documentation they had developed for fighting, creatures that conventional military doctrine had never anticipated. Their final transmissions described desperate battles in underground complexes where the distinction between enemy and environment had become meaninglessly blurred. The Free States, a loose confederation of survivalists and libertarian communities that had been preparing for social collapse long before the Great War actually arrived, had initially seemed better positioned to thrive in the post-nuclear environment than more conventional communities. Their bunkers were better stocked, their members were better trained in wilderness survival, and their decentralized organization was less vulnerable to the cascade failures that had destroyed more centralized societies. Yet even the Free States had ultimately succumbed to the unique challenges of the Appalachian wasteland. Their radio transmissions, preserved in automated relay stations throughout the mountains, chronicled a gradual erosion of cooperation and mutual aid as individual communities became increasingly isolated and suspicious. The very independence and self-reliance that had seemed like advantages during the immediate post-war period had become liabilities when facing threats that required coordinated response and shared resources. The Brotherhood of Steel's Appalachian chapter represented perhaps the most tragic example of institutional courage and systematic failure in the entire post-war period. Led by Paladin Elizabeth Taggarty, they had maintained their commitment to preserving technology and protecting civilians even as their resources dwindled and their members died one by one. Their final stand against the Scorchbeast threat had been a calculated sacrifice, using nuclear weapons to eliminate the creature's primary nesting sites, while knowing that the radiation would make the region uninhabitable for generations. Taggarty's final holotape, recorded moments before the nuclear strike that would end both the Scorchbeast plague and her own life, captured the essence of what the Brotherhood represented at its best and worst. Her absolute dedication to duty and protection of others was admirable and genuinely heroic, but her inability to adapt Brotherhood doctrine to local conditions had contributed to the failure of their mission. The technology they had sought to preserve was meaningless without the human communities they had sworn to protect. The Enclave's presence in Appalachia revealed another dimension of the pre-war conspiracy that had shaped post-nuclear America. The White Spring Bunker, hidden beneath a luxury resort that had catered to political and corporate elites, had served as a continuity of government facility where pre-war officials had attempted to maintain federal authority through automated systems and remote communications. Their Modus computer system had continued implementing federal policy for decades after the last human officials had died, creating a surreal parody of democratic governance administered by artificial intelligence. The automated production facilities that dotted the Appalachian landscape demonstrated both the potential and the dangers of unmanned industrial systems. Factories continued manufacturing goods according to pre-war production schedules, stockpiling resources that nobody was left to distribute or consume. Military installations produced weapons and ammunition for armies that no longer existed. Research facilities conducted experiments that nobody was left to monitor or evaluate, sometimes producing results that posed new threats to anyone unlucky enough to encounter them. Yet among all this evidence of institutional collapse and technological failure, the Vault 76 dwellers discovered something that had been largely absent from other regions' post-war experience: hope. Not just the desperate hope of individual survival that had driven other communities to rebuild from ashes, but institutional hope embedded in systems that had been designed to continue functioning even after human oversight ended. The overseer of Vault 76, who had emerged ahead of the other residents to prepare the way for reclamation efforts, had left behind a trail of recordings and supply caches that documented her journey through the region and her growing understanding of what had happened during the 25 years of Vault isolation. Her messages revealed someone who had maintained faith in both human potential and American ideals even when confronted with overwhelming evidence that both had failed catastrophically. The CAMP system, an automated construction technology that allowed individual survivors to establish temporary or permanent settlements with minimal resources and expertise, represented a genuine technological breakthrough that other regions had never achieved. These construction and assembly mobile platform units could transform raw materials into functional buildings, defensive structures, and resource production facilities within hours rather than the months or years that traditional construction required. More importantly, the CAMP system was designed to be shared and interconnected, allowing individual settlements to support and reinforce each other in ways that created genuine communities rather than just collections of isolated survivors. The technology encouraged cooperation and mutual aid rather than competition and hoarding, creating social structures that were more resilient and adaptable than the rigid hierarchies that had characterized other post-war societies. The Scorchbeast Queen, the massive creature that had served as the central node for the plague that had devastated Appalachia, represented not just a military target, but a symbol of humanity's relationship with the natural world in the post-nuclear age. This wasn't simply a mutated animal driven by instinct and hunger, but something that seemed to possess intelligence and purpose that transcended individual survival. Its defeat required not just superior firepower, but genuine cooperation between survivors who had learned to trust each other despite coming from different backgrounds and holding different values. The nuclear silos that remained functional throughout, Appalachia presented the ultimate test of whether post-war communities could learn from pre-war mistakes. These weapons of mass destruction could eliminate immediate threats like the Scorchbeast Queen, but using them would also perpetuate the cycle of nuclear devastation that had created the wasteland in the first place. The decision to launch nuclear weapons, even for ostensibly defensive purposes, carried moral weight that no individual should have been forced to bear alone. The resolution of the Appalachian crisis came not through the emergence of a single dominant faction or the implementation of a master plan developed by pre-war authorities, but through the gradual recognition that survival and prosperity required cooperation between individuals who respected each other's autonomy while working toward shared goals. The Vault 76 dwellers didn't rebuild America by recreating pre-war institutions, but by creating new forms of social organization that preserved the best aspects of American ideals while adapting to post-war realities. The communication networks that the survivors established throughout Appalachia became the foundation for something unprecedented in the post-war world. Not just trade routes or military alliances, but genuine information-sharing networks that allowed communities separated by hundreds of miles to learn from each other's successes and failures. Knowledge about agriculture, medicine, technology, and social organization flowed freely between settlements, creating a culture of innovation and adaptation that had been largely absent from other regions. As the Appalachian wasteland slowly healed from the Scorchbeast plague and began attracting new settlers from other regions, it became clear that something genuinely new was emerging from the nuclear ashes. Not a recreation of pre-war America with its contradictions and inequalities, but a society that embodied the democratic ideals and individual freedoms that America had always claimed to represent, while avoiding the corporate authoritarianism and military imperialism that had led to the Great War in the first place. The stories scattered across 2 centuries of post-nuclear America begin to weave together into something resembling a pattern as we step back to survey the full scope of human experience in the atomic age. Each community, each individual, each choice made in the shadow of mushroom clouds contributed to a vast experiment in social evolution that was conducted without hypothesis, without control groups, and without any clear understanding of what success might actually look like. The West Coast's transformation from a collection of struggling settlements into the new California Republic demonstrated that democratic institutions could indeed emerge from chaos and desperation, but also revealed the challenges that success brings to idealistic movements. The NCR, that had begun as a federation of mutual aid societies, had evolved into something resembling the pre-war American government, complete with territorial expansion, military adventurism, and the gradual concentration of power in the hands of wealthy elites and professional politicians. President Aaron Kimball's administration embodied both the achievements and the contradictions of post-war democracy. Under his leadership, the NCR had expanded its territory, improved living standards for its citizens, and created institutions that provided stability and security across hundreds of thousands of square miles. Yet this expansion had come at the cost of the small community values and cooperative idealism that had originally inspired the Republic's founding. The NCR's treatment of independent settlements and tribal peoples increasingly resembled the imperialism that had characterized pre-war America's relationship with its neighbors. The East Coast's slower recovery from the Great War reflected both the severity of nuclear damage in that region and the different cultural and institutional foundations that had shaped community development there. The capital wasteland's emphasis on individual heroism and personal sacrifice had produced remarkable achievements like Project Purity, but it had also created social structures that remained fragile and dependent on exceptional individuals rather. than robust institutions. Elder Lyon's transformation of the Brotherhood of Steel from a technology-hoarding cult into a genuine protective force demonstrated that even the most rigid organizations could adapt and evolve when faced with overwhelming moral imperatives. Yet his successor's return to more traditional Brotherhood values after his death showed how difficult it was to maintain institutional changes that weren't supported by deep cultural transformation throughout the organization's membership. Mojave's complex web of competing factions illustrated the reality that post-war America would not converge on a single model of social organization, but would continue to generate diverse approaches to the fundamental challenges of governance and community life. Mr. House's technocratic autocracy, the NCR's expansionist democracy, and Caesar's totalitarian militarism each represented legitimate responses to post-nuclear conditions, each with genuine strengths and serious weaknesses. The independent Vegas ending, where the Courier rejected all factional allegiances in favor of local self-determination, suggested that the most important decisions about post-war society would ultimately be made by individuals and communities rather than by grand strategic planners or ideological movements. The Mojave's future would be shaped by thousands of daily choices about cooperation and competition, trust and suspicion, freedom and security, rather than by any single political or military victory. The Commonwealth's confrontation with the Institute forced post-war communities to grapple with questions about consciousness, identity, and authentic human experience that hadn't been relevant during the simpler struggle for physical survival that had characterized earlier decades. The successful integration of liberated synths into surface communities demonstrated that humanity's definition of itself could expand to include artificial beings who displayed genuine consciousness and moral agency. Yet the Institute's destruction also represented a rejection of the utilitarian calculus that had justified so much pre-war and post-war suffering in the name of greater good and future prosperity. The Commonwealth chose messy, inefficient, genuinely human democracy over perfectly planned synthetic paradise, accepting the costs and uncertainties that came with authentic choice and individual autonomy. Appalachia's unique experience as a region where Vault-Tec's promises had been largely fulfilled provided a crucial control case for understanding what post-war recovery might have looked like if the pre-war institutions had actually functioned as advertised. The region's automated systems had maintained infrastructure and preserved knowledge in ways that had allowed rapid reconstruction once human populations returned to claim their inheritance. But Appalachia also demonstrated that technology alone couldn't solve the fundamental challenges of post-nuclear existence. The Scorch-Beast Plague had required human cooperation, courage, and sacrifice to overcome. The region's recovery had succeeded because individual survivors had chosen to work together despite their different backgrounds and conflicting interests, not because superior technology had made cooperation unnecessary. The pattern that emerges from these scattered stories is one of gradual learning and adaptation rather than linear progress toward predetermined goals. Each generation of post-war survivors had faced unique challenges that required them to balance competing values and navigate complex trade-offs between individual freedom and collective security, between preserving useful aspects of pre-war civilization and avoiding the mistakes that had led to nuclear catastrophe. The most successful post-war communities had been those that maintained flexibility and openness to new approaches rather than rigid adherence to ideological principles or technological solutions. Shady Sands had thrived by adapting its agricultural practices to local conditions. The hub had prospered by creating trading relationships that benefited all participants. Diamond City had survived by welcoming refugees and immigrants who brought new skills and perspectives to their community. The least successful communities had been those that became trapped by their own success or their own ideology. Vault City's prosperity had bred arrogance and isolation that made them vulnerable to external threats. The Master's super mutant army had been doomed by its creator's inability to accept that perfection might not be achievable or even desirable. The Enclave had destroyed itself through its commitment to genetic purity that excluded the very people it claimed to represent. The corporate and government conspiracies that had shaped post-war America through Vault-Tec's experiments and the Enclave's manipulation had ultimately failed because they had misunderstood the fundamental nature of human resilience and adaptability. The planners who had designed social experiments and genetic purification programs had assumed that human behavior could be predicted and controlled through proper incentives and environmental manipulation. But the actual survivors of the Great War had consistently confounded these predictions by developing creative solutions to problems that their would-be controllers hadn't anticipated. The communities that had emerged from the wasteland hadn't followed the patterns that pre-war social scientists had expected, but had instead created new forms of organization that combined elements from different cultural traditions and adapted continuously to changing circumstances. Perhaps most importantly, the post-war experience had demonstrated that human dignity and individual autonomy weren't luxuries that could be temporarily suspended during crises, but were instead essential components of any sustainable society. The communities that had preserved space for individual choice and cultural diversity had proven more resilient than those that had prioritized efficiency and uniformity. The radiation that had initially seemed like humanity's death sentence had become, over time, simply another environmental factor that required adaptation and accommodation rather than elimination. The ghouls, who had been feared and rejected by early post-war communities, had eventually become integrated members of society, who contributed their extended lifespans and pre-war memories to collective survival efforts. The technology that had both created and survived the Great War had found new purposes in the hands of people who approached it as a tool for human flourishing rather than as an end in itself. The same computers that had once calculated optimal, nuclear targeting solutions were repurposed to coordinate trade routes and agricultural production. The same manufacturing systems that had produced weapons of mass destruction were adapted to create shelters, medical supplies, and communication equipment. The wasteland itself had become something more than a memorial to pre-war failure or a testing ground for post-war experiments. It had become home to communities that had learned to find beauty in adaptation, strength in diversity, and hope in the simple fact that life continued despite everything that had been done to prevent it. The lessons learned through 2 centuries of post-nuclear survival wouldn't prevent future conflicts or eliminate the possibility of new catastrophes, but they had created a foundation of knowledge and experience that would allow future generations to make more informed choices about the relationship between technology and society, between individual freedom and collective security, between preserving the past and adapting to an uncertain future. War might never change, but the people who fought wars, who survived them, and who built new societies from their aftermath had learned that change was not only possible, but inevitable, and that their choices about how to change would determine whether humanity's future would be shaped by fear and hatred or by hope and compassion. The sun sets over the Commonwealth with the same gentle warmth it once brought to the suburbs of pre-war America, but the light falls now on a world transformed by choices rather than destroyed by circumstance. In Diamond City, children who have never known the fear of unclean water play in streets where their grandparents once huddled in radioactive storms. The baseball diamond that forms the heart of their community echoes with laughter instead of gunfire, and the walls that once kept out the dangers of the wasteland now frame gardens where mut fruit and corn grow in soil that has slowly healed. itself through decades of patient cultivation. Along the trade routes that connect the Commonwealth to the capital wasteland and beyond, caravans carry more than goods between settlements. They carry stories, songs, and the accumulated wisdom of communities that have learned to thrive rather than merely survive. The Brahmin that pull their wagons move with the unhurried confidence of creatures who have found their place in a world that no longer seems intent on destroying everything they touch. In the ruins of Boston, nature has reclaimed much of what humanity abandoned, but it has done so gently, weaving green, growing things through the spaces between buildings rather than tearing down what might still prove useful. Flowers bloom in window boxes tended by settlers who have made homes in skyscrapers that once housed corporations and government agencies. The harbour, where ships once brought trade from around the world, now hosts fishing boats whose crews work waters that are slowly becoming clean enough to support life rather than merely tolerate it. The radio signals that cross the wasteland carry music and news, weather reports and philosophical discussions, love songs and technical manuals for repairing the countless machines that keep post-war civilization functioning. Three Dogs' voice no longer broadcasts from Galaxy News Radio, but the tradition of independent journalism and community communication that he established has spread to every corner of the recovering world. In Vault 111, now converted into a memorial and research center, visitors can walk through the cryogenic chambers where one family's tragedy became the catalyst for an entire region's transformation. The exhibits don't glorify war or celebrate destruction, but instead chronicle the patient work of individuals who chose cooperation over competition, healing over revenge, growth over stagnation. The Institute's underground laboratories have been transformed into educational facilities where the sciences that once served domination now serve discovery. Students from across the wasteland come to study medicine, agriculture, engineering, and philosophy in classrooms where the most advanced technology serves human curiosity rather than human control. The synthetic humans who survived their creators' fall have become teachers and researchers whose artificial origins matter less than their contributions to the ongoing project of rebuilding civilization. On the West Coast, the new California Republic continues to evolve and adapt, learning from its mistakes and growing beyond the limitations that once threatened to transform it into a mere replica of pre-war America. The democratic institutions that began in small farming communities now serve millions of citizens across a territory that spans from the Pacific Ocean to the Colorado River. Their flag flies over cities that have risen from atomic ashes, not through conquest, but through the patient work of people who refused to accept that destruction was permanent. In New Vegas, the lights still burn bright against the desert darkness, but they illuminate more than gambling tables and entertainment venues. The city has become a crossroads where different approaches to post-war life meet and learn from each other. Traders from NCR territories exchange ideas with Caesar's former subjects who have built new communities based on principles of mutual aid rather than military domination. The technologies that Mr. House developed for his personal ambitions now serve the broader goal of making the desert bloom with sustainable communities. Throughout Appalachia, the mountains echo with sounds of construction and cultivation as new settlers arrive daily to participate in the ongoing experiment in democratic reconstruction. The CAMP system that once allowed individual survival now enables rapid community development, creating networks of interconnected settlements that share resources and knowledge while maintaining their unique cultural characteristics. The scorch beasts that once terrorized the region have become, in death, part of the landscape's natural cycle. Their bones provide minerals for agriculture. Their former nesting sites have become gardens where rare plants grow in soil enriched by their decay. The ultrasite that marked their presence now powers clean energy systems that provide abundant electricity without the environmental costs that had made pre-war energy production unsustainable. The robots that still wander the wasteland serve functions their creators never intended. The Protectrons that once enforced corporate security now help maintain trade route safety. The Assaultrons that were designed for military destruction have been reprogrammed to assist with heavy construction and agricultural work. Even the mighty Sentry bots have found peaceful purposes, their massive frames providing mobile power sources for communities that are still building the infrastructure needed for long-term prosperity. In libraries and schools across the recovering continent, children learn about the Great War not as ancient history but as a living reminder of the costs that come with prioritizing power over compassion, efficiency over justice, control over freedom. They study the rise and fall of the Enclave, the transformation of the Brotherhood of Steel, the success and struggles of the new California Republic, not to memorize dates and names, but to understand the patterns of choice and consequence that will shape their own generation's decisions. The ghouls who survived the atomic fire share their memories of the world before the bombs, but they also participate fully in building the world that will exist long after their extended lifespans finally end. Their experiences bridge the gap between pre-war mistakes and post-war wisdom, providing continuity that helps newer generations understand both the value of what was lost and the importance of what has been gained. The vaults that were once prisons and laboratories have become museums and community centers, their sturdy construction adapted for purposes that serve life rather than death. Some house archives where the knowledge of multiple civilizations is preserved and shared. Others have become workshops where artisans combine pre-war technology with post-war creativity to produce goods that are both functional and beautiful. The radiation that once seemed like humanity's death sentence has become simply another part of the environment that must be understood and accommodated. The storms still come, but they are met by communities that have learned to shelter together and emerge stronger from shared adversity. The background count that measures in rads rather than rems has become as natural a part of weather report as temperature and precipitation. As night falls across the wasteland, the darkness is no longer absolute. The lights of human communities create constellations on the ground that mirror the stars above. Radio transmissions carry voices speaking dozens of languages, singing songs that combine pre-war melodies with post-war experiences, telling stories that weave together the threads of a tapestry that spans centuries and continents. In the quiet moments between day and night, when the work is done and families gather around dinner tables in homes built from salvaged materials and sustained hope, there is time to reflect on the journey that has brought humanity from the edge of extinction to the threshold of renewal. The world that exists now is not the world that was lost, but neither is it the world that was feared. It is something new, something that could only have emerged from the choices made by individuals who refused to accept that destruction was final or that hope was foolish. The atomic age began with the promise of unlimited energy and ended with the reality of unlimited responsibility. Every person who lives in the post-war world inherits both the legacy of those who unleashed atomic fire and the obligation to ensure that such fire serves life rather than death in whatever future they create for their children. Tomorrow will bring new challenges and new opportunities, new choices that will determine whether the lessons learned in the wasteland will be remembered or forgotten. But tonight, in communities across the continent, people sleep safely in beds they have, made from the ruins of yesterday, dreaming dreams that are their own to choose, in a world where war may never change, but where people, somehow, always do.